This is the disclaimer for Wildlife Control Consultant and Pest Geek Podcast for the Living the Wildlife podcast. Always follow national, state, provincial, and local laws when using pesticides and or other control methods to manage pests. Wildlife Control Consultant, LLC, Pest Geek Podcast, Living the Wildlife Podcast, Stephen M. Vantassel, or their or his affiliates are not responsible for followers' use of the information provided here.
Hi everyone, Stephen Vantassel here, Wildlife Control Consultant, bringing you another episode of Living the Wildlife as part of the Pest Geek podcast family. Hey, glad to have you on board here today. I hope you've had a great week, and and I hope you're thinking about what the future holds as we're on the cusp of 2022. Just take a few moments, if you would, and be sure to sign up to our podcast and also join us on Facebook. You can see us there at the Pest Geek Podcast family. So definitely join us. Join the revolution, as Franklin calls it. And we'd be glad to have you on board. Ask your questions. And also, if you want to reach me, you can reach me at wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. Wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. Would love to hear your thoughts, comments, suggestions for new shows. And email really is the best way to get a hold of me. So if you're looking for a consultation, definitely drop me a note and we can discuss that as well. On a side note, I am looking for individuals willing to sell me some rodent scat. Yeah, you've heard that correctly, rodent scat. I'm looking for house mouse scat, Norway rat scat, and roof rat scat. I'd like to have at least 20 items in preferably dry condition. They can be either pre-toxicant rodenticide or post-rodenticide. I'd like to actually have a mixture of both, plus like a colored scat. And if you're interested in supplying that, I'm looking to pay for it and take care of your shipping as well. So you can definitely reach out to me at wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. I'd love to hear from it. I don't need deer mouse scat. We have lots of deer mice here in Montana, and unfortunately we don't have a lot of house mice, or I guess fortunately, depending on what side of the fence you're on. Don't have a lot of Norways, don't have a lot of house mouse, and we don't have roof rats. So I'd love to have some of those scats if you're willing to sell those to me. All right, well, last time we were together, we talked about the 10 best wildlife control websites, but I was only able to get through 1 through 4. So let's go over those quickly again. We have the Digital Commons at the Internet Center for Wildlife Damage Management, University of Nebraska-Lincoln. We have the publications of the Vertebrate Pest Conference, and we have the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. And then lastly, we talked about the update, or at least the chapters that were updated for the Prevention Control of Wildlife Damage, often known as like the Bible of Wildlife Control. And I told you that there are a number of chapters. I think we have probably 25, maybe 30 chapters that have been updated. I know I was involved with 4 of them. Very proud of that. You can find those publications available at the link above there. So now we're in number 5. Just a reminder, these numbers are not necessarily in order of priority. Okay, so I had to order them one way or another, and so this is the easiest way. But don't necessarily think that number 1 is better than number 2. Okay, it's not that kind of sequential. I think that's called cardinal numbers. Okay, so it's or ordinal numbers. It's not an ordinal number, it's just a cardinal number. We just have to put a number to it just to kind of put it in sequence. All right, the next particular site, let me kind of pull that up for us here, is going to be the Human Wildlife Conflicts at the Mississippi State University. Again, this tends to be a rather academic type site. However, those of you who are dealing with some big issues that are often hitting agriculture will find this to be useful. Wild hogs, information here on wild hogs, Asian carp, avian influenza, if you want to take a look at what that can do. That's a big concern. That's one of these days it's going to erupt and it's going to do a crossover for us. We've already in the COVID pandemic, of course, but we also have to look at things that are actually caused by nature without human intervention. I believe that COVID was human developed, but there's certainly going to be, I'm sure, a debate about that. We have the bat white nose syndrome, and then, of course, when wildlife attacks. So it tends to have a rather agricultural type focus, very academic in that regard, rather than, the technician at the field level handling someone's squirrel in their attic. Okay, so, but again, I would just remind you all that how much more is there really to know in that area? And it's not to say that there isn't things to know. I believe there are. However, when we're looking at where you would put your research time into, how much benefit are you really going to get reading another article about trapping gray squirrels? So if you have to be looking at wildlife resources in the sense of where are you looking to expand your business. And so sometimes you have to be looking at the horizon and saying, is it likely that wild hogs are going to reach my state? Are they in your state already? Are you servicing those clients? Are you allowed to service those clients? Are you pushing? And if that happens, do you know how to identify their damage? How about Asian carp? What happens if Asian carp gets into someone's private pond, for instance? Do you know how to handle that? So there's a variety of ways to use this information and try to read before a new issue hits you, for example. Even understanding about avian influenza can be helpful in that regard. All right, so that's basically the Mississippi State's human-wildlife conflicts, and let's take a little quick look at some of their research areas. Again, this is their research area on hogs. Notice all the publications they have here, and some of these are available right for immediate download. Here's one by Ganchoff and Wang and Ballant and Bayer, Scale-Dependent Home Range Optimality for Solitary Omnivore. Okay, that is a pretty academic title, but basically I think it's going to be something about how these feral hogs have home ranges when they're isolated. But that would be my guess of what that's all about. You may think, so we have to sometimes translate some of this into English, but if you were wanting to know, if you trap this one feral hog, can someone have an isolated feral hog perhaps? And how much home range, maybe this hog is damaging one neighbor, but the other neighbor likes the feral hog. Can you trap that feral hog in someone else's property? How close do you have to be? That sort of thing. All right. Well, you can see this information for yourself. And again, here we have another spotlight, of course, of the Human Wildlife Interactions Journal, which I've mentioned. I believe I've mentioned that before, but if not, we'll get to it relatively soon. So now we have our next particular site, Inspectopedia. This website, I'm telling you, wow. It is an absolutely an amazing place. If you're not familiar with it, let me encourage you to check it out. It is like drinking through a fire hose of information. Inspectopedia.com. As the name sounds, it is how to inspect structures as if you were a home inspector. And you say, well, I'm not a home inspector, Steve, and I do wildlife control or I do pest control. I totally get that. But what you're looking for here is how to identify problems in structures so you understand air conditioning, heat pump systems, wildlife damage prevention for homes, how to understand mobile homes. Because if you don't understand the structure that you're dealing with, you're not going to understand how that animal is going to behave within that structure. Can you drill through that wall? How do you drill through the wall without making sure you're not going into an electrical wire? Or at least you probably can't be sure to be certain. However, you can reduce your risk, because if you're like, well, did the electrician follow standard electrical practice, for instance? Do you know what standard electrical practice is? Do you understand chimneys? I've done presentations on a chimney several weeks ago. And so this is how do you deal with flooding? How do you deal with air filters? And so the more you can understand about the building you're dealing with, the better you're going to be able to inspect that structure and know what should be there and what isn't there. Because isn't it a good idea that if you find a particular structural problem in a house, that you can at least let the homeowner know, even though you're not an inspector? Nothing wrong with that. mean, things about septic systems and solar energy. Let's take a look. Let's take a look at the structural one. All right, we're going to close that. So now we're going to building structures. Again, he has a lot of ads here because this is free. Okay, in the sense there's no charge for you, so he has to make his money one way. So don't hold that against him. But here he has diagrams on housing structures. And you just keep reading down here, a ton of links, Adobe, different types of instruction, Adobe construction, architecture, building component ID, how to name different things. You do a training with your people on what things are named as so that you standardize your lingo for your literature. Remember, when it comes to a lawsuit, are you prepared to talk competently about what your knowledge is? And if you're using the same lingo all the time, that strengthens your case because there's consistency in your inspection process. Okay, so this site is truly amazing. I would encourage you just to take some time when you're getting your oil changed for your business. Just check this place out. It is truly amazing, and I would suspect you're going to be able to really understand and expand your knowledge of homes and structures and terminology and all kinds of stuff. It is an amazing site. So I think if you're going to find anything you want to learn about how to inspect homes, this is the site to at least you need to touch base with. Let me click this other one on forensics. Forensics in buildings. And so how to deal with building failures. Have you ever walked out on a deck or a porch or a balcony and like, is this safe? Well, this is information on how you would determine, structural stuff like that. Remember, you need to be thinking about these things. Just because I was walking in an attic once, going from joist to joist, and I'll tell you, I think I was foolish to do it because there was some give in that, and it was a very old building, and it had huge ceilings. I think they might have been maybe 15, 20-foot ceilings, and it had like a balloon type attic, and it was massive. And I'm walking across this thing, and it was giving, and I'm saying to myself, could that have broken? Could I have fallen through and plummeted 15, 20 feet down? I think so, yeah. You need to be learning about some of this stuff, right? So you may not have done anything wrong, but if the structure itself gives way, that is a huge, huge problem. But anyways, check this site out, inspectopedia.com. Again, it is just an amazing site. He even has a search area, so if you have a particular term you want to look into, you can definitely check that out. All right, so let's move on here. Let's go on to number 7, human-wildlife interactions. Okay, I've mentioned this before. I didn't talk about it yet, other in any detail, but let's check out this particular journal. This is a peer-reviewed academic journal that deals with wildlife damage issues. And again, a lot of the topics are more agriculture, wilderness type topics. However, you will be getting information on species biology about things that are going to be that do impact the human-urban interface with wildlife as well. So it's not just always about an animal in Yellowstone National Park. It'll talk about bear damage that occurs in communities. So those of you living in more suburbia, exurbia, maybe rural areas will really find a lot of the articles here rather interesting. They'll also talk about a lot of bird issues as well. So let's take a look at the latest issue in terms of what some of the topics are. Let me kind of blow this up so you can read it a little bit better. Here we have a profile of wild pig hunters in Texas. And you say, why would I care about wild pig hunters in Texas? Well, are they potential competition? Is this someone that you would want to necessarily hire? How would you find the person? What are characteristics? If you wanted to hire someone, let's say your company got a big contract to remove feral hogs, what kind of person would you want to hire for that? Well, this is an article you'd want to read it for that, right? Hunter motivations and use of wild pigs. Does hunting affect behavior of wild pigs? There's a big debate about, maybe not too big of a debate, but there's some thought that states shut down hunting of pigs, partly because they don't want to create the hunting culture, but also there's the notion that if you shoot a pig, it causes the sounder to scatter, and it makes them harder to control. Is that true? Well, I would assume that article delves into that. Wild boar issues in other countries, which can be rather interesting. You might see techniques and tactics that are used elsewhere that maybe haven't been found in the United States yet. And then it has research articles and notes. Here we have reduced fecundity, which is reproductive rate in free-ranging Norway rats after being baited with a liquid fertility control bait. Well, think about that. I would suspect that's one of the baits that's available. It's a liquid bait now. I am an investor in that particular company, so just to have some clarity on that. No, the company is not doing all that great in terms of its stock price. But here we have the abstract, and it talks about this particular product that's being used to treat rats to reduce their reproductive rate and how well or not it works. And so that may be of interest for you, for those of you that do with rats. And of course, rats are in urban areas as well. Here we have some other articles. Human bear conflict and community perceptions of risk in northern India. Again, you're trying to get into the mind of people there. Characteristics of non-fatal attacks by bears in the continuous United States. Do you know why a bear doesn't kill? That would be an article about that for those of you in bear country. Places like New Jersey have big problems with bears. Here we have close encounters of the feral swine, and then they have a 50th anniversary for Wild Free Roaming Horses and Burros Act of 1971. Of course, that was a terrible, terrible law. Never underestimate how stupid certain laws are, and that was certainly one of them. Devastating to our environment, but I digress. Managing deer conflicts and things of this nature. And of course, you can browse various issues, look at all the various issues that are available. So it goes back several years, and you can do a search. Whoops, let me go back. I'm sorry. Let's go back and search. Again, we're going to do using coyotes again. Let's try coyotes here. All this information on coyotes. Here we have evaluating lethal and non-lethal management options for urban coyotes. Do you deal with urban coyotes? Does non-lethal work? Is it effective? To what extent? How are you going to answer your clients' questions? Coyotes, again, are pretty much nationwide now in the continental U.S. Here, what happens when you remove a coyote? Do you have the ability? Because these are often political issues, and are you able to answer those types of questions? How about repel? Does repel work as a coyote repellent? I don't think it's registered for coyotes, but these are sometimes some research that's been used because you may find customers using stuff just because they have nothing else to do. So again, available for you. There is no additional cost. This is funded from, I believe, some various government things. So again, I don't call it free. It just means you don't have to pay for it again. All right, let's get on with number 8. And I wanted to point out some state/regional resources. Obviously, a lot of states have their own material, and I would encourage you to have that hot linked on your favorite web browser, and you should do that. But I wanted to point out some web pages to just different parts of the country that you may not be aware of that would still have species and issues that would be valuable and contain information valuable for you and for your company. So here we have Virginia, where there's the outreach wildlife damage, so we can kind of click that. And again, they have a minimal amount of information here, but if you're interested in learning how to control moles and snakes and burrowing crayfish and fun, that's certainly a big issue in certain parts of the country. Black bears, again, beaver, and how to address the consequences of predator damage to livestock and poultry. Again, not a lot of information to be sure, but again, you'd want to try to make sure you're reading a couple of sources, because one of the things, just because something is published by a university doesn't mean it's 100% correct. I mean, I hate to say that to a certain degree because it should be right. However, the reality is when it comes to wildlife control, a lot of universities rely on people whose specialty is in bugs. And that is not a really good thing. And so they often will repeat the same information of that's wrong from another university site. Let me give you an example. They'll talk about, and I think we've gotten rid of a lot of these, but you might see some of them hanging around where they'll talk about, well, sprinkle some powder in front of the den hole and then monitor, and then when the animal leaves, close the hole. Now, I haven't found anyone who's been able to do that successfully. So it's silly. That's the kind of error we're looking at. Or they'll talk about doing something, they'll just let the animal go free, or they won't mention how to dispatch it. Right? There's just another big error. The publications I was involved in, we talked about how to kill it. And that, I think, helped move other university materials into that direction as well. But anyways, there's Virginia. You can certainly look into that. We go to Montana. Here's my webpage. This is my day job, for those of you who don't know, and I have a bunch of material here. This is the publications I'm responsible for. Here I have a publication on bats and starlings and prevention of woodpecker damage and how to identify field rodents, Montana snakes, and then I have pesticide use materials, and then rodent control materials. And so here we have voles in Montana, and how to calibrate cyclone cedars and Richardson ground squirrels, Colombian prairie dog, pocket gopher, and controlling mice in and around structures. And then I have links to other publications I was involved with before I came to the Montana, how to remove skunk odor and rodent-proof construction and urban pest birds and that sort of thing. So again, all of this information is not free, but it's no additional cost because it's funded by the great people of Montana. So you don't have to pay for it again. So let's go back to another site. California, of course, is a huge, huge market, and it has a lot of different habitats there. And so here we have information from the California Fish and Wildlife Department. California, as you know, has been going through basically a destruction of its wildlife management program by basically banning various forms of harvesting. And that type of mental disease is certainly going to be infecting other states. Nevertheless, I know I'm getting a little political here, but I always take the opportunity to bash stupidity when I see it, and certainly California is up there along with Massachusetts and other states that have adopted sort of animal rights ideologies that are really fundamentally opposed to responsible environmental management. So, nevertheless, they do have wildlife information here that you can certainly take advantage of, and you can view that wildlife habitat conservation management, wildlife welfare and rehabilitation, the state's wildlife action plan, California wildlife habitat database. That's sort of interesting. You want to find out if a particular species may be in your area, you can probably check that out here, and how you can get GIS data for this if you're interested in going that far. That may be something of interest. You can learn about fishing, hunting, of course, the various laws available, how to live with wildlife. That may be something valuable for you if you want to get some background on how to help people deal with maybe less lethal control methods. Is certainly something that you can download as well, because if it's going to work, California will prove it, but I want you just to be cautious. A lot of these less lethal options have limited effects and really requires lots of people to keep employing the same tactics. And of course, all it takes is one neighbor who just feeds animals, and all of your efforts basically are for naught. So if everyone does it, it's a problem like it's the tragedy of the commons, right? It's where all it takes is one person to be a jerk, and it won't necessarily work. Nevertheless, you should be familiar with these materials and learn about them, as well as how do other states handle big animals. And I think this is an area in wildlife control that we really don't do a good enough job on, is we're not thinking about how do we expand our markets. I mean, should we be dealing with bears? I believe we should be. Should we be dealing with deer? I believe we should be. But that requires political pressure to be brought to bear to have states start loosening up their restrictions to allow those species to be handled by private companies. So that's, again, I'm getting on my little political hobby horse here, but I think a lot of wildlife control operators are not thinking about the bigger picture, and they're not thinking long term, and they're just thinking about how do I make money in the next 5 minutes. You should think about that, but it shouldn't be the only thing you're thinking about. All right, let's go back. So we have Texas wildlife. This is rather interesting. This is a pretty powerful site. Again, Texas is another massive state. Their laws down there I haven't quite understood them. I would love to have someone explain wildlife law in Texas. I believe there's some sort of difference between wildlife control within a city and wildlife control outside the city. I haven't quite figured that all out yet. If someone want to drop me an email explaining that to me, I would love to hear about it, because it seems a bit kooky, to be quite frank. But nevertheless, a lot of good information here. Here we have, aquaculture. Those of you, again, in an agricultural environment, how do you handle birds at aquaculture facilities? And of course, coyotes, feral hogs, ground squirrels, moles, all types of resources here that are available for you that are published by this particular entity. And so these can be training materials used for your employees should you decide to do that. Here we have stuff on woodpeckers. I know I used I believe some of their information in my publication on woodpeckers. And so they have some interesting stuff here as well. So anyways, definitely a source. Even if your state's resources aren't that good, you can definitely check out Texas A&M if you're in the area, and that's going to be a source for you as well. All right, that's enough for number 8. Let's move on to number 9. And so pesticide information. And so I know a lot of wildlife control operators don't deal with pesticides, or at least you think you don't. A lot of times you're using products as a pesticide, even though you don't think it's a pesticide. Remember, it's not in order to use something legally, it has to be properly registered with the EPA, and you have to probably be licensed in order to use pesticides on someone else's property. In some states, like Nebraska, last I knew, does allow commercial people to use repellents on someone else's property without a license, but not other types of products like rodenticides. Nevertheless, if you are not licensed to handle pesticides as a wildlife control operator, let me take this moment right now to encourage you. You need to start getting your license. Do it now. This is important. Even if you don't plan on using your pesticides, you need to get it just in case, because it gives you flexibility and another tool in your toolbox to handle wildlife control issues, or should I say vertebrate control issues. Well, one of the sites you'd want to consult to learn more about pesticides, namely, is the pesticide legal and is it registered in your state? Remember, many states, you have to have, in order to use a pesticide legally, it must be registered by the EPA. That's number one. That's federal. But the state would also require it to be registered within its own state. For example, in Montana, in order to use a pesticide product in Montana, it must be registered by the EPA and it must be registered in Montana. Now, why is this important? Because when you go online to purchase a product, you're going to get that product shipped to you, but that doesn't necessarily mean that product is legal to use in your state. I had to call a manufacturer of one particular product, and I said, your product's not registered in our state. Why is that? Why is that? And it should be. And I finally kind of had to guilt them into registering the product with our state, because I had a very strong suspicion the product was being used in our state. And certainly when the advertising's out there, it didn't say not legal in Montana, right? So don't expect these pesticide companies to do the work for you. That is your responsibility to make sure your products are legal. So how do you do that? Well, you can certainly contact your state wildlife agency, or you can go to Kelly the Kelly system here. And notice not every state is listed, but let's go up to Washington State here, and you can then do a pesticide registration search. And you can do it by, as I'm doing it here, we're going to do it by active ingredients. So I'm going to do a search on strychnine. And then it has strychnine or strychnine alkaloid. I'm just going to pick strychnine, and there you go. These are all the products in the state of Washington that are registered in the state of Washington and they're legal to use in the state of Washington, provided you have the appropriate licensing. There you go. And that's how you're able to look. And if you want to learn more, you can just simply click one of these items, and then you can get access to what's called the EPA stamped label. And this is the label that the EPA signed off on. So there you go. We have 2020. And voila, there's your label. Okay, so you can learn a lot of information about the types of pesticides by their active ingredient, by their company, and that's certainly one company that does that, Kelly. The one I like to use is Nepier's. It's out of Purdue. And again, so you have two competing companies here, or two competing groups about about recording pesticides. Notice they don't have all the states either, but my state is listed here. And here we have our search data. And it's not as powerful as the Kelly system because it's not as granular. Not in the free side. It's more granular on the paid subscription side. So the Kelly side has a lot more access without having to pay for it. Where the Nepier's, you have to pay to get more granularity. By that I mean you can get into different types of pests. Let me compare that up with the Kelly system here if I can get to it. Just to compare. Open that back up, and we're going to do a pesticide registration. See all the different options you have. You can search by company name, product name, pesticide type, active ingredient, by company ID, state EPA registration number, formulation type, and search EPA database multiple criteria. Look at all the different options you have. Where in Nepier's, you only have four options: EPA number, state product name, state company name. Now, if you pay a subscription, and I'm not suggesting that you do that, but if you pay a subscription, you get additional options down the road. But anyways, let's take a look here at active ingredient. Let's look at strychnine. And it will ask you which type. And then then it gives you all the companies that have strychnine products that are registered in the state of Montana. And then you can click that particular company and you can see, voila, Martin's Gopher Bait 50R, and one is restricted, one is not restricted. And you can click here and get the pesticide label. It's the EPA stamped label, and there you go. So those are two websites that will help you, and pretty much one or the other will have your state, generally speaking. Just find whether it's Kelly or whether it's Nepier's, and hot link that to your web browser so that you can always check up to see if a particular pesticide is registered within your particular state. All right, now we're finally on number 10, and here we have some training resources that I wanted to expose you to. This is the pesticidestewardship.org. This is a website that I was involved with. It's a nonprofit type deal. Notice there's my name there. So again, a little tout for me. This is wildlife damage management, and it basically talks about the philosophy and theory of wildlife damage management. What is the process? So this can be used as a way of introducing your employees, or maybe even yourself, to refresh your understanding. How do you explain what you do? What is the philosophy of wildlife damage management? I'm not a philosopher. I just go out and kill animals. No, you do have a philosophy. There is a method to your madness, right? Or to our madness, I should say. There's a way we go about doing things, and that's what's called a philosophy. If you are the HSUS, Humane Society of the United States, they have a different philosophy about how to handle wildlife damage problems, right? And we have disagreements, or I should say I have disagreements with their philosophy. So this is a place where you can learn more about that, and it talks about how to handle various things. And so you click here, down here in the lower left. Let me kind of blow that up for you and move that over so you can see it a little better. Notice that under wildlife damage, it has when to contact a professional, wildlife control professionals, what they are, their definitions, hiring one, and this is a category of how well do you match up to that. Let's click that one. How well do you match this list? Because this is what we're training the public to look for in terms before they hire a wildlife control operator. We want them to be thinking about these things because we know it's hard to change regulations, but if we can change consumer behavior, that will be a push to drive the industry to improve its professionalism. Okay, so you have regulatory control. That's sort of a top-down method, very hard to do. Or you can change the environment that people are hiring in. The customer, the better educated the customer is, the higher their standards are going to be, the more that the professional has to raise their game in order to meet the rising standards of a consumer. An educated consumer is always a wonderful thing for a true professional. If you're a hack, you don't want educated consumers. That's the difference. Other information here, laws concerning wildlife damage management, and we have a little diagram here that we created on how to deal with the law. Are you familiar with that law? Are you familiar with this flow chart? Because it's complicated. Wildlife law is complicated, to be sure. We tried to simplify that to the extent possible. Talk about human disease. You want to learn about diseases in zoonotics in a very brief sort of way with some additional resources that you can find. This is an area for you to start. So if you're looking for that sort of eagle eye view of the field of wildlife damage management, this is a great website to go to. Lastly, we got to Newco.net. This is a website that has a book on training information. It's was published originally out of Cornell, if I recall correctly, but it is a full-on manual for training wildlife control operators, and again, it is available at no additional cost to use. So if you're looking for a book to sort of train your wildlife control operators, this is a book to use. Now, is it perfect? No. Does it have problems? Yes. However, it is an excellent way to get the ball running. It is primarily geared for a more northeastern type of environment in terms of the United States, but a lot of the foundational information is applicable anywhere in the United States. And I would even think Canada as well. Just be careful of some of the law issues that are dealt with. But it's basically giving you an introduction in a more thorough way of what wildlife control is all about, what types of terminology that your workers need to understand, and how they should approach resolving conflicts, the steps necessary. And that's a very important tool. So this is something that's all online, and they can just go through it. It has little quizzes. And if you want to get a certificate, you can pay for the exam, but the information for the course itself is available at no additional cost. And so I think that is worthwhile in and of itself. Lastly, that's basically it. We have our 10 items, and so there's my book, The Wildlife Damage Inspection Handbook. I hope you found the information on the 10 websites. As you well know, there was far more than 10 websites there, but basically 10 types of resources available for you, some better than others, and I will continue to revise this over time. However, if you have maybe I missed one that you think is awesome. I mean, I'm looking as I'm reflecting back over my choices. I had one that I was like, oh, I probably shouldn't have chosen that one. We will definitely be interested in hearing your particular thoughts. So definitely reach out to me at wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com, wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. Do take a few moments this coming year and commit yourself to saying, look, can I read one journal article a month? Can I read one wildlife control book this year? That's not a big ask. Keep it by the toilet and just read a little section. You'd be surprised how keep one in your vehicle. You'd be surprised how you can just a little bit of time. When you have some free time, just work your way through that material, and you'll be surprised what you can accomplish within an entire year and how it will deepen and impact your particular business. Well, I'm Stephen Vantassel. You've been listening to Living the Wildlife. I'm the part of the Pest Geek podcast family, and we call it Living the Wildlife. Why? Because we want you to live the wildlife, not be the wildlife. Take care, everyone.